Over 2,000 years ago, long before the arrival of the Romans, this was an important place. It was a well-worn route, and it marked the boundary between Celtic tribes. Later, it became a major Roman road, running from the south coast through London to Anglesey, and known as Watling Street. In 410 AD, the Romans left, leaving the British to fend for themselves. Before long, they were suffering frequent attacks by the Picts and Scots, and sought help from the Anglo-Saxons. These mercenaries arrived in large numbers, however, and settled, giving birth to the nation now known as England. But then, in the 9th century, Danish Vikings invaded and occupied the eastern half of the country, creating the Danelaw. Watling Street was now the boundary between the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons. Today, the road has become the A5, and it remains an important artery. Let's look at just some of the significant places to be found along the few miles of Watling Street, from Towcester to Nuneaton. Towcester claims to be one of the first continuously inhabited places in Britain, from the Stone Age to the present day. For the Romans, it was a garrison town known as Lactudurum. It may have been the site of the Battle of Watling Street, fought in about 61 AD between Queen Boudicca's Celtic army and the Roman occupiers. Boudicca was soundly beaten. Today, Towcester is an attractive market town and home to one of Britain's major racecourses. A few miles northwest and we come to the site where an invention that dramatically changed our world was first put to the test. Back in 1935, in these fields in Upper Stow, Robert Watson Watt, a descendant of the steam pioneer James Watt, along with his colleague Arnold Wilkins, demonstrated the first ever radar. Their system could detect bombers at a distance of at least 8 miles, and it went on to play a major role in the Allies' defeat of Nazi Germany. On our way to Weedon, we find a remnant of the early Industrial Revolution. Canals were already taking much traffic from the very inadequate roads. Railways were just starting to make an impact, but there were gaps, especially where hills got in the way. The London to Birmingham Railway had a 22-kilometre break that passengers and freight had to cross by road. But the going was really tough over the rutted, muddy surface. Then, in the 1820s, engineer Thomas Telford built a stoneway alongside the dirt road. Passengers were carried in large coaches, pulled by teams of horses. Its working life was short, however. Just 10 years later, the Kilsby Railway Tunnel was opened, and trains could now go through the hills. The stoneway soon fell into disrepair and was abandoned. At Nether Hayford, just south of Weedon, we come to another of the many Roman settlements to be found along Watling Street. This is Whitehall Farm, site of a villa that has recently been investigated by archaeologists. Stephen Young has played a major role in the project.
We're standing at the site of a Roman villa at Whitehall Farm, which is part of a rural landscape that's associated with Watling Street. Watling Street is fundamentally important to the development of Roman occupation of this area. It's the important trade route and communications route, and it has various roadside stations along it, and the nearest one to us is at Banaventa. And this site is about 5 kilometres away from Banaventa itself. It's one of about 20 sites, most of which develop into villas in the later Roman period.
At about the same time, Weedon hosted another, even more important engineering work. Napoleon had conquered much of Europe and was threatening to invade Britain. We needed armaments, and a safe but accessible storage site was chosen right in the centre of the country, on Watling Street.
This is an absolutely unique site because it's hidden away actually in Weedon, which is off the main track. It in fact is a large area of at least 8 particularly large Napoleonic buildings dating from really the very earliest of the 19th century. So looking around it, you may wonder why it was sited here, and of course the answer is, when the Napoleonic Wars were actually starting, the country in general needed somewhere where the armaments for the soldiers could be safely stored, and they chose Weedon, 100 miles in either direction to the sea. And now, of course, we see it today, complete with the canal connection, which came in 1820, and then the railway came here in the 1840s, when the Main Coast Line, which is literally within a quarter of a mile of here, opened. It was here in use by the military right up till 1965, the mid-60s. And by that time, of course, it had expanded enormously. It also, on the top side here, was the area for the School of Equitation, where the cavalry were trained, and that was all run down long prior to 65, and in 65 they finally decided to dispose of it altogether. Today it's used primarily for small businesses, storage, distribution on a very small basis, a lot of craft industries.
A bit further north, and we find a place familiar to users of the M1 motorway, Watford Gap. This was the UK's first motorway service station, opened in 1959. Watford Gap has nothing to do with the large Hertfordshire town of Watford, but takes its name from the nearby Northamptonshire village. So, what is the Gap? Well, it's a pass or gap through the hills that for millennia has been used by many forms of transport. First, it was the route taken by the Roman Watling Street. Next, the canals used it to avoid having to climb too many hills. They still needed quite a few locks, however, such as this impressive flight at Watford. Soon after, the railways also took advantage of the pass to keep their gradients as gentle as possible. Finally, the M1 motorway also squeezed through the gap, so that today we have all four important arteries running cheek by jowl with each other. Nearby is Ashby St Ledgers, a small village with a lot of history. In this small room above the gatehouse of the Tudor manor, the conspirators met in 1605 to plan the gunpowder plot to blow up the king and parliament. They failed, of course, and we now burn effigies of the major conspirator, Guy Fawkes, every November the 5th. Soon after Ashby St Ledgers, the A5 passes over the M45. Built in 1959, it's the UK's only heritage motorway. It gained this unlikely status because, since the opening of the M6, it's become very underused and has consequently needed hardly any upgrading. Drivers along the A5 often wonder what the row of small castles is all about. Of course, they're not really castles, but air vents for the Kilsby rail tunnel. This tunnel, which runs for over 2 kilometres, was built in 1838 to bridge that gap in the London to Birmingham railway. Just off the A5 we find the town of Rugby. Its main claim to fame comes from Rugby School, where it is said the game of rugby football originated. Visitors come from around the world to see the hallowed ground. As Watling Street leaves the Rugby area, we come to Durft, the Daventry International Rail Freight Terminal. This is just one of the many huge distribution complexes along this part of the A5. It's unique, however, in having its own railway system, a spur off the main West Coast line. Durft is being built largely on the site of a very large Iron Age settlement at Barby Nortoft, most of which will soon be buried under concrete. Immediately next to Durft we can see the few remaining masts of Rugby radio station. It opened in 1926 and for many years Malcolm Hancock was station manager.
My name's Malcolm Hancock and I was station manager at Rugby radio station until I retired. And of course it's very obvious driving down the A5, most people remember the large 820-foot masts as you go down. They were constructed in 1924-25, 12 of them, 820 feet high. And the reason for them was we wanted empire communications to the world, or to the empire, and the big transmitter that used the big masts sent out signals in Morse code right around the world. The news broadcast, for instance, could go out to Canada and New Zealand at exactly the same time and be received by both. And even today, I think the long wave service like that is the only way you can sort of wrap right around the world. Following that, in 1927, for the very first time, you could speak to America from this country. £15 for 3 minutes. £600 odd today, so not cheap. And Rugby then became the centre really of radio telephone communication with shortwave services. They're the smaller masts you may have seen as you drive down the road. And by the mid-30s, Rugby was called the telephone exchange of the world. And if you wanted to make a telephone call to anywhere in the world other than the near continent, it would have gone through Rugby radio station. Of course, following the satellites, cables first of all in the 50s, and then satellite communications, these requirements gradually diminished, and Rugby went over to ship services for quite a while. Finally, they ended in 2000, and the other services ended 2003, 2007, including the time signal service, which also came from there. And the masts, well, the big ones, which everybody could see with the big lights on the top, you could see for miles. 8 of those were felled in 2004, and the other 4 went in 2007. Now it looks like it's going to be a large housing estate.
Ends as in the past, with the whole Commonwealth of English-speaking nations listening to the speech of His Majesty the King.
The year that is passing, the 25th since my accession, has been to me most memorable.
In addition to BBC broadcasts and the international time signal, the station was used for long-range communication around the world, including that with the UK's fleet of nuclear submarines. This made Rugby a prime target for Soviet nuclear missiles, something that is hopefully no longer the case. Having once been a Roman road, it's not surprising to find many important settlements from that time along Watling Street. This is Tripontium, just northwest of Rugby. There's not much to see now, but when the site was excavated in 2005, many significant artefacts were recovered. Victoria Gabitas, of Rugby Museum, looks after some of the finds.
The Roman site of Tripontium is a Roman way station, and it lies on the Watling Street, and it falls halfway between a similar way station at High Cross to the north and another one to the south at Banaventa, which is close to Weedon and Daventry. These way stations served an important purpose for the Roman imperial machinery. Imperial messengers could travel the length of these roads and get refreshment at the way stations. They might be able to spend the night there. They might maybe change their horse for a fresh one. And so messages were travelled the length and breadth of the country. One of the most important artefacts to be found at Tripontium is this milestone, and it just tells us who the emperor was at the time that the milestone was erected. It says, Emperor Caesar Flavius Valerius Constantinus, good, fortunate, unconquered Augustus, son of the deified Constantius Pius Augustus, which is a lovely set of titles, I always think. Tripontium's a mixture of a site. Part of it is the Roman way station with the important central building, which would be the Mancio, with a bathhouse attached. This was the main functional building of the site. But attached to it there were a number of other lesser buildings, and we know that there was a Romano-British settlement established around the way station. So what started out as a small functional site for the Roman officials travelling up and down the Watling Street turned into a little local settlement. This tile, I'm very fond of this one, it's got a footprint on it. Clearly somebody was making the tiles and laid them out to dry, and somebody padded across. There's the big toe, there are the smaller ones. It's quite a small foot, I think it might even have been a child.
Another major distribution site on the A5, and perhaps the biggest in the UK, is Magna Park. Before taking on its current role, the land was the site of Bitterswell Airport, which was built during the Second World War, mainly for training pilots. It was later taken over by the aircraft manufacturers AWA as an assembly and test site. Now it's home only to lorries. High Cross, the point where Watling Street crosses another major Roman road, the Fossway, which leads to the southwest. This is another location laying claim to being the site of that Battle of Watling Street, where the Romans defeated Boudica, queen of the rebelling Iceni tribe of Britons. It's also one of several claimants to being the very centre of England. This monument was erected in 1712 by the Denbigh family, in grateful as well as perpetual remembrance of peace, at length restored by Her Majesty Queen Anne in 1712. Close to High Cross lies Wigton Parva, once yet another Roman settlement. Since 1160 it's been the home of Leicestershire's smallest church, St Mary's. Wigton Parva has known troubled times, and in 1579 there was an uprising against the landowner Henry Turville, who was set upon in a most warlike manner by disgruntled villagers, all armed with staves, swords and daggers, who beat him thoroughly. The next major town on Watling Street, just to the east, is Hinckley. It has long been known for its hosiery manufacturing, originally by hand knitting. The first framework knitting machine was brought here in the 17th century, but it didn't go down well with the workforce. Castle Street is the first known location of Luddite vandalism, where disgruntled workers whose jobs were threatened took sledgehammers to the machines. Perhaps less well known is Hinckley's claim to being the birthplace of the hansom cab in 1835. It's been a star in many Sherlock Holmes movies. Hinckley also has a long history of engineering and is home to the Triumph Motorcycle Company, the last such manufacturer in the UK. This may look like a mountain in the Warwickshire Plains, but in fact it's an old spoil heap from the stone quarry in Nuneaton. The town was once an important coal mining centre, but the pits all closed some time ago. Nuneaton's main claim to fame is as the one-time home of Mary Ann Evans, better known as the novelist George Eliot. Her works, which have read worldwide, include The Mill and the Floss and Middlemarch. Our journey ends at MIRA, the Motor Industry Research Association. MIRA offers a world-leading range of facilities for developing and testing all types of motor vehicle, from motorcycles to buses and tanks. Vehicle manufacturers from around the globe come to MIRA to use, amongst other things, its wind tunnels, electrical testing laboratories, and a whole collection of test tracks. Today they're being used for testing the very latest electric racing cars. From Romans to racers, and for well over 2,000 years, Watling Street has a rich history, and all in just a few miles.